We are very privileged to have Mr. Will Furman here today. Will Furman's photographs bring together a lifetime of immersion in film, drama, theater, music, and photography. He received both a BA and MA in television and motion pictures from San Francisco State University. His master's thesis included a documentary film, The Stones of Eden, photographed in Afghanistan. Retiring after 40 years of directing and photographing hundreds of film and television productions, he became a fine art photographer, photographing mostly landscapes and historical locations. His first book, Bodie, Good Times and Bad, just published, is a history of Bodie, a famous California state historical park. It includes a new photographic technique he developed called FotoReflections that captures the magic of the Old West in a fresh and powerful way. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Will Furman.
Thank you. Thank you, TJ. You have a wonderful facility here, and I'm pleased that you all came out on today, the voting day. Don't forget to vote if you haven't. But I wanted to ask, first of all, how many of you have been to Bodie? Oh, there we go. You know that it's a very different place from any of the other parks, state historic parks in California or in the West. It really, really is unique. And this, what I'm going to tell you, is the story of how it got to be that way, and also I'm going to then show you that along the way I developed a new technique, photographic technique, because Bodie, to me, since I first went there in the 60s, had a kind of magic that I didn't find anywhere else. And it was kind of a haunting place to me that I just always felt like they had just left yesterday. You know, I mean, they just stepped out for lunch. They'll be back in an hour. And so I had photographed Bodie many, many times, but I had never been able to get, and they're all nice, good pictures, but I'd never been able to capture what the kind of a magic that I felt there, that feeling of going back in time and feeling, that I'm just part of that, which is, of course, why we go to these historic places, because we want to feel like what it was like back then. So I developed this technique, which you'll see some of the pictures as we go along. They appear like superimpositions, but they're all taken with one click of the shutter. Instantly captured both images together. And so let's start out with the story, the history of Bodie first. That's the book that came out of this. Bodie, Good Times and Bad, which I have in the back here, which you can buy for $25 after the show if you're interested. It's beautifully printed and on wonderful heavy paper. It's as good as any National Geographic magazine you'll buy. But the story of Bodie really starts in 1859 when William Bodie discovered some gold. He was going down to Bishop to try and resupply for the winter, and when a freak snowstorm came in late October, and he froze to death. But others soon found his site, so small mining camps sprang up. In 1863, Leland Stanford created the Bodie Bluff Mining Company. He capitalized it, he said, at $1 million. However, a few months later, he sold all his holdings for $500. But in the 1870s, Bodie was a dangerous, remote place with very little law and order. But there was gold to be had if you dug for it. Nearby Belmont, Nevada, was a silver bonanza town of 4,000 people, but the silver was starting to peter out. So families began to think about moving on. One of the families that decided to go were the Brothertons and their 5 children. On the night before they left, it is rumored that the daughter said, as she knelt to say her prayers, "Oh, goodbye, God. I'm going to Bodie. However, there was nobody there to record what she said, so she might have said, good, by God, I'm going to Bodie. We'll never know. But getting to Bodie was a rugged affair. Poor roads, but once you finally got there, this is what it looked like. And Bodie is at 8,475 feet. It's 10 miles east of the Sierras and 10 miles north of Mono Lake. The miners that were drawn there, their faces tell a lot of the story. Families came without it wasn't just miners, and of course some of the families had kids. So in the beginning, homeschooled their kids. They made a life however they could. Soon there were about 10 children to teach. So they finally got a school together. They'd been homeschooled first, and they decided to that first school burned down by a disgruntled student. So they put an ad in the paper for a teacher that would be able to control the students. So, but then in the same time, they took over a boarding house and added a cupola and a school bell and pronounced it a school. The teacher that they hired, they were having trouble with the students, so he said, listen, you give me the job and I will control these students. Don't worry about it. And the students were about 150 at the time, and the teacher that was hired said, I'll use my gun if I have to. But he didn't have to. Instead, he wielded a long-handled stove poker, which much of the year, because it's cold there, could be quite hot if you left it in that stove. And one child remembered that teacher sure did handle all those tough kids. Well, it wasn't just tough kids. This was the time of dime novels. There was Slapshot Sam, Dick the Dead-Eye Dandy, and Twilight Charlie that you see here. Of course, those were fictional characters, but in real life, there was plenty of danger. With gold ingots leaving Bodie every few days, there were plenty of opportunities for ambush. Even if there was no gold, passengers' wallets were there for the taking, and purses and watches. Stages would sometimes stop at the place of a previous robbery and wait for the robbers to appear because they didn't want to get hurt themselves. This is a mock-up of what it would look like. The county kept a record of deaths, whatever the cause. Shootings were said to be a nightly occurrence. But the reputation of a bad man from Bodie spread. There were gunfights. Mark Twain said when he was passing through Bodie, said he would have it no other way. Virtue versus vice made for exciting times. Twain wrote, "It's a plain wonder how a man can carry on in such circumstances." And there was a lot of gunfights many mornings. Druggist or the undertaker would find a body on their doorstep. They called it a man for breakfast. Bodie earned a reputation as a violent, hell-bent corner of the desert West. The reality in Bodie was there were serious consequences for tough talk. These are some of the quotes that were reported in the newspapers. Arguments were often settled with guns. One man, Bill Dugan, dueled with Felix Donnelly at long range. They exchanged 9 shots, but not even a bystander was killed. Bodie was called Bad Shot Gulch because men in Bodie were bad shots. I think that's why they got that term. The truth is, besides the regular revolvers, 6-shot revolvers, they weren't accurate except at close range. And many people carried the pocket-sized single-shot Derringer on your left, or a British Bulldog, which was a gun that was popular in Bodie. It could be easily drawn and fired at close range, the only distance at which it was accurate. But it's likely that there were more deaths from mining accidents, pneumonia, cholera, and other causes than from gunfights. The first church was built in 1882, the Methodist Church, and it still stands today. Church attendance was strong. There was a lot to pray for or atone for. The Catholic Church burned in a fire and is no longer there. In the race to get the gold, many mines had very little safety devices or procedures. They shored up the workings only when it was necessary. Only one mine had safety cages that you see here that have been common in the West for 10 years. In the race to go deeper, mine owners would also skimp on pumping adequate air down to the miners. Then, at 436 feet down, the Bodie mine hit a very rich vein of ore. They named it after the Greek goddess of fortune and a favorite of the miners. The Fortuna vein caused mine shares to jump from $6 to $60 a share. They followed the vein down, lost it, found it again, and at 600 feet, the vein widened into a gigantic bonanza. One man's shovelful could be worth more than a year's wages. With such intense riches, what could be the harm in a miner keeping some of it for himself? I mean, the Lord put it in the ground. Didn't it belong to whoever found it? Deuteronomy 25:4 says, "Muzzle not the ox that treadeth the corn." Well, the reality was that some of that gold would find its way into the miner's shoe or in his cuffs of his pants or even in his hair, strangely enough. I wonder how it got there. So they finally took to having the men strip and wear clothes that the mine owners provided and taking a shower and collecting anything that came out of the shower. Well, for the next 400 feet, there were glorious riches. But then the vein forked, then fractured, then gave out. They dug down hundreds of feet more, but found only fragments of the vein. At 1,200 feet, the search was abandoned, its lower workings left to decay, crumble, and collapse. Winter in Bodie was long and hard. At 1.5 miles high, it was often the coldest place in California, then and to this day. Somebody just told me 5 minutes before we started it was the coldest place in the U.S. Yesterday. I know a week ago it was Fairbanks, Alaska was 20 degrees and Bodie was 3 degrees. So thermometers could easily reach -30, -40. The loneliness and isolation was often cured by a visit to one of Bodie's 35 saloons. Sometimes the snow was so high you could only get out through a second-story window. Drifts could easily be 15 feet or more. Notice the snow depth gauge on the left. With such intense snows, mail obviously could not arrive. And that was their only contact with the outside world. So when it came, it was a big event. In the isolation of winter, people entertained themselves with music or singing, and you could hear pop songs and opera. John MacDonald was eloquent reciting Shakespeare and was known to quote the Bard by the yard. There were dances. The Miners' Union Hall was mounted on springs, so the dancing didn't shake the building apart. On Sundays, the only day off, people would play in the snow. Ski clubs were formed with 10 or 12-foot skis. Nobody could turn or brake as today's skiers did. And the only way down was straight down. And to slow, you had to drag the pole between your legs. But the ski clubs, when they formed, they had races, of course, and they were clocked to going as fast as 90 miles an hour, often ending in spectacular crashes. I wouldn't want to think about what their ankles looked like after a crash in those boots, with your skis tied, with your ankles tied to the skis. Children were fitted with skis as early as age 4. Spring finally comes to Bodie around May at 8,400 feet. In 1879, a young man aged 21 moved to Bodie. John Stuart Kane, astute and easygoing, he cared about Bodie. He parlayed his ownership of a piece of the Fortuna gold vein into owning the town bank. He ended up owning most of the town. In 1879, although the glory days are gone, this is one of the houses you can go into, but it's easy to imagine what this house might have looked like in 1880. There's beautiful wallpaper, paisley, with wonderful edging at the top, and and there was a nice brick mantel, a fireplace there at one point. The houses in Bodie show a series of changes over time as the new owners adapted them, but the structure is often still solid. It's so dry there. Might be 8,400 feet, but it's still desert. The feeling that they just left yesterday is everywhere. I wonder how much money passed through this store safe. $2.5 billion in gold in today's money was taken out of Bodie. Many of the homes tell volumes about the life that existed, both modest and opulent. These were expensive silk fabric, wall fabric coverings, and a hand-carved bed. This is Boone's store. Their stores carried just about everything, including the newest and the most fashionable. Boone's store here looks pretty much the way it would have 100 years ago, except there would be a fashionable dress on that dress form. If people in Bodie had money, they tended to spend it. A fancy carriage would make you look smart and stylish driving through town or down to Bridgeport, the county seat 20 miles away. Of course, if you had a carriage, you would want the clothes to go with it. Bodie's women dressed well and were no stranger to vanity. Julia Burnett here shows off the high fashion of her day. When summer finally arrives, it's most welcome after the long winter. It snows every month of the year in Bodie. On July 4th, midnight, Bodie's 23 operating mines all let their steam whistles go simultaneously. It was the signal for a giant 3-day celebration. Oddfellows, Elks, and Masons would march, as well as veterans of the Mexican War and the Civil War. Everyone came out to watch and listen. The girls on this float are holding 38 pennants, one for each state of the Union at that time. There were games, contests, and foot races. The men here are having a 3-legged race. Games involved most everybody. How many kids fit on a donkey? Of course, the boys would set off firecrackers and cherry bombs during the holidays. There was also a group that was called the Bodie Horribles, who heaped abuse on the self-important, the pompous, and the rich. They appeared in a satirical procession, making discordant music and noise. Their slogan was, "Do unto others as you darn please," without allowing them to return the compliment. Except for a few holidays, mining operations rarely stopped. The stamp mills crushing the rock could be heard going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Standard Mill is the only stamp mill that remains today. This is a 5-stamp battery, one of 7 in the mill. These large, heavy steel stamps go up and down like pistons, crushing the rock. The crushed rock would then vibrate down these tables, which were covered with copper plates that were coated with mercury. The mercury absorbed the gold, and only the gold. The mercury was then scraped off and boiled, leaving only pure gold. The mercury vapor was captured and cooled, making it liquid again to reuse. In the 1880s, a new process was developed for extracting the gold. John Stuart Kane built a plant in Bodie that had vats of sodium cyanide, that you see here, which would reprocess the ore from the old crushed rock. Taking out gold, the mercury process had missed. But it was dangerous work. This pouring a gold ingot in the retort room of the stamp mill. There were many dangers in mining. The biggest danger is from explosives and dynamite that they had to have to blast the gold out of the rock. This is hard rock mining. But dynamite is always dangerous, and accidents can and do happen to this day. July 10th, 1879, at 7:30 p.m., just as the wife of the mine's hoisting engineer was bringing him his dinner, a gigantic explosion occurred, knocking her to the ground unconscious and hurling her baby 10 feet, breaking its arm. Seven men were killed instantly. Others had missing limbs, eyes, broken arms, ribs. The undertaker's morgue was filled. More victims followed in the subsequent days, and it hit the community hard. Life was hard, and life was often short. At night, Bodie took on a different kind of aura. The Bodie Cribs in the red light district was a world unto itself. Located on Bonanza Street, there were dance halls, saloons, even mercantiles. Then there was one woman that was different, Rosa May. In her younger years, she had worked in Virginia City and Carson City, but moved to Bodie in the early 1900s. Rosa May had a boyfriend, Ernest Marks, a Main Street bartender, but she also liked and saw other clients. She would listen to them, write letters home for them, darn their socks. She had the fanciest red lantern of anyone in town. And when a pneumonia epidemic gripped Bodie, Rosa May tended to the sick, going from one cabin to another to console and nurse them back to health. Quote, many a time she closed tired eyes that would never open again, unquote. But the day came when Rosa May contracted pneumonia herself and a few days later died. So the question was, where to bury Rosa May? Was she a saint or a sinner? Would she be buried in the town cemetery on hallowed ground or not? The town was divided. In the end, she was buried just outside the cemetery fence in the area that was reserved for the gunfighters. The Bodie Morning News observed that, quote, whatever else may be said of the class known as fallen women, they are always to be found more generous, kind, and forgiving than in the case of their more virtuous sisters. As people moved away, Bodie became largely a place of empty buildings. So John Stuart Kane hired guards to protect the town against vandals, thieves, and collectors. The days of gold, the days of old, were gone. The people who came to Bodie made nowhere somewhere. The glory years were something to behold. In 1932, there were still about 100 people living in Bodie. Many mine workers retired and just didn't leave until they died. There was still the hearse to take them to the cemetery when the time came. Former miners or children who'd grown up in Bodie would come back. This picture shows a Hollywood movie crew that came to make a film in the late teens or early 20s. Behind the saloon on June 23rd, 1932, a 2.5-year-old playing with matches lit a dangling piece of wallpaper. "Look what I done," he told his mother as she rushed to him. The town raced to get the hoses, but the neglected water mains were clogged with dirt and rocks. The fire spread quickly. They ran to the pumpers, but there was no water to refill the pumpers once they'd exhausted what they had in the tank. Half the town was burned, but 170 buildings survived. There's 110 buildings still today. So this is John Stuart Kane. His bank was burned to the ground. Only the large vault survived. Kane's wife started to have health problems, and they moved to San Francisco. But Kane returned to Bodie periodically to make sure his town was okay. Kane's heirs sold the town to California in 1962, and it's now a state historic park with rangers on site. It's open 365 days a year. So that concludes the first part of my talk, which the story of Bodie, all of which is in the book that I have in the back, which is $25, including tax. It has all the pictures you've seen here and tons more. And very, very good writing as well. I'm the photographer on the book. Nicholas Clapp wrote the text, and it's really a nice book. Well, I was looking for, as I mentioned, a way to capture the magic that I always felt in Bodie, and this is what I came up with, and I'll show you. I'm going to show you the pictures that you've already seen in the slideshow, but I'll talk about the technique and how I did it, because it's something that anybody can do. I mean, it's not easy, but it's a way of seeing, because all of this stuff is right here. It's one click of the shutter. I don't do any Photoshop. I'm not adding anything. Everything is captured in one click of the shutter, and that's it. So I call it FotoReflections, F-O-T-O, reflections, and I'm always standing outside and looking through a glass surface into a building or space. So it produces a translucent and a reflective image simultaneously. And the wide angle gives a close-up at the same time, and a wide angle gets you all of the background. A completely natural superimposition of images. The results draw you into the photograph as each person makes sense of the different layers. As your eye wanders around the frame, it is picked up by different elements, and so then your interest shifts to a different kind of interest. And each person discovers the town in their own way, much as we do when we visit any of these historic sites. They're partly puzzles, but because here I'm looking through the window, I see directly through the window in the room inside is the bed springs and the chair and the hat and the window there, which I can see through. But all the rest of the picture is a reflection. All the buildings and the sagebrush and the hills and the sky is all a reflection. This is wavy glass, the old handmade glass, and the two sides are not parallel, so that you get a distortion in it, and there are double shadows, and because another phenomenon of shooting through glass is that and this is a physics law of physics, 85% of the light is reflected from the front surface of the glass, and 15% is reflected off the back side of the glass. And that's just true with every piece of glass. But because it's such a little amount, we tend not to see it. But with the wavy glass, it accentuates it because the front surface is not parallel to the back surface, and neither surface is flat. They're all going like this. This is looking into the church there, and the camera's always close because I think it makes it more dramatic. I usually am shooting with a pretty wide-angle lens, a 20 or a 32 or a 16 millimeter frequently, but I'm usually 12 to 20 inches from the glass, and I'm just off from to the side. You'll see that all of these are at an angle, and that's so that I don't see myself in the picture. Well, I had a print of this particular picture here, and I had it in. I was giving this talk at the California State Library in Sacramento, and unbeknownst to me, this older guy comes in, and he's looking around, and he introduces himself. He's the state librarian, Greg Lucas, and he looked at the print of this picture, which was about like this, and I said, explained to him what the technique was, and he looked at it, and I said, after looked at it for 20 seconds or something, I said, what do you think? And he said, oh, I like it. I said, what do you think of the hill? And he looked at me, he looked back at the picture, and he looked back at me, and he said, what hill? I said, you don't see the hill? He looked back at the picture. No, I don't see the hill. And then I pointed out the hill to him, and the road and the sagebrush and all that. And he said, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Well, he said, and then he came by and watched a lot of the presentation and talked with me after, and he said, this is a great way to make history come alive, and I'd like you to do if you have a bunch of these images, I'd love to have an exhibit here at the library. We don't have photographic shows, but because I'd like to have all of state government to be able to, see these and be able to use this as a tool to be able to, because I have an explanation of the technique up there on the wall too, and so I agreed, came up and installed it. And if you're in Sacramento, it's been there for 7 months, almost 8 months now. It is in the State Library and Courts building, right across from the Capitol, right across from the legislature, and it's right outside the Supreme Court on the ground floor, right next to all their offices and so forth. And the Chief Justice, who's a woman, she just loves looking at them when she goes up there. But I can see why as a judge, because this is showing you both sides of the showing you this point of view and that point of view. And if that's not what they do in court, I don't know what they do. Anyway, so you connect with what you see in your own way, and you don't entirely get every image immediately. So you can always find new things, and we each find our own meaning in the pictures. In our fast-paced world, we look at images and make quick decisions whether we like it or not, and we move on. But if you relax with these images and let your eyes wander around through the different layers, you come to understand it in a different way, in a deeper way, because you really make your own connections. And it certainly does, for me, make me feel like I've gone back in time in a way. Again, in this one, you have the window in the room up there that I'm seeing, that's in the room itself. Each person is struck by different things in the image. Moving the camera just the tiniest bit changes what you see dramatically, because this is a flat mirror, and if you move a mirror just the littlest bit, it changes, especially if you have a big mirror. Because it's basically showing you 180 degrees behind you. Most of the time I set it up to take 3 exposures. This is to compensate for the extreme range of light in the scene. This particular photograph, I am standing in the window, but because that right where that bright window was, so it overpowered my shadow. So I'm not seen. But that's the only picture I ever took where I was straight on. Okay, now how did this technique evolve? I told you I wanted to capture it in a different way, so I went up there on a trip and then started photographing in a way that I'd never seen anybody do it before or me. I was trying to find different angles from different, just trying everything I could think of to just do something that may seem crazy or stupid or weird or whatever, just see if I could get something. This was a picture that I took that really captured, there was something about the picture, this particular picture, which I really liked, but I didn't know why I liked it. And the more I thought about it, I realized, okay, what I like about this, and a number of my artist friends, they really liked it as well. And I think what I came to understand is that I'm seeing multiple planes. So here I'm seeing the church and the street and the clouds through the window. So there's that plane of information. Then there's the information of the wall and the frame of the window and the shade up at the top and the trim at the top of the picture. And then you have the mirror over on the and that's reflecting the window behind me. So I said, okay, it's different planes. So how can I make different planes? Well, the most logical, having two different planes, is a normal reflection, and which I've always loved doing, but inherently reflections are always interesting. Because you have, but I think it's because there's a second plane, and because it's showing you a different perspective. Well, the technique that I came up with is just a different kind of reflection. I'm just using glass to do it, and so. And many times I have to go back and photograph it several times to make sure to get the lighting right or improve the picture. This is one image that was a scene that I liked. I'd photographed it a couple of times, and this is one of the times that I worked on it with. I just do burning and dodging, which is lightening and darkening. That's what Ansel Adams did. That's all he did, and that's all Edward Curtis did, going all the way back to 1850 when they discovered photography, just to lighten and darken areas. And I do this all digitally. I don't shoot it with film, but it's the same process. And but this was good, but it wasn't really good. So I finally went back another time I was going to Bodie because I was doing a lot of photography there, and so. That's what I finally decided, okay, this is a good picture. I like this better. It's the same view, the same place, but the lighting is different. And so that's the one that I finalized. Here's another picture, a scene that I just was going around shooting as potential things, I like this. I think there might be something there. I should go back and work with that again. So I went back another time, another day. That's exactly the same window, but I have gotten the lighting is good and it's even. You can see there's somewhat cloudy, so it's evened out the light. I'm going to now move on to show you some other examples of that same technique in other cities. That's Virginia City. That's Randsburg, down in Southern California. That's Columbia State Park. That's a Chinese apothecary. I'm looking into the window, but it's reflecting the doorway that I walked into the place, and you can see that the store across the street, the lettering is all backwards because it's reflection. That's Virginia City, down in Chinatown, a broken window but it's reflecting the town. This is the Mizpah Hotel in Tonopah, sunrise. It's McGill, Nevada, north of Ely. An old soda fountain, kept exactly the way it was in 1950. That's Columbia State Park. That's Castle Dome, Arizona. It's Ely, Nevada, Railroad State Park. I'm looking through the window of a caboose and out the side window of that caboose, and I matched up the lower tracks with the reflection as well as what I'm seeing straight, because it's the same plane. But the yellow caboose, I got that, it wasn't able to line the tracks up, but I got the body of the caboose to line up with the train. This is San Francisco Maritime Park, used to be Hyde Street Pier, and it's an old ferry boat. And I'm looking into a little room that's about 10 feet deep that has some of this memorabilia in it. But the windows reflect all the windows looking on the outside of the ferry boat. That's all reflection, and the roof is all reflection. All the posts are reflections. You can see the piling. There is that guy sitting on the newspaper, which is holding up the roof. Or appears to be, I should say. This is Sidewalk Cafe. You can be right by the traffic. That's the St. Francis Hotel and Union Square, San Francisco. St. Francis is reflected in the glass that I'm shooting through, but I'm also seeing out the front of the store and able to see the red bus and the palm tree. Over on the left, you can see how the cable car tracks come down and then disappear, which of course is impossible. And the right-hand side is a foil or a mylar wrapped post that holds up the building. Which is why that kind of has a funny little... This kind of reminds me of Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. It's isolation. Nobody here is talking with anybody. There's some, I don't know, 15 people or something in this scene, and nobody's talking to each other. Here you are in the middle of this huge city. The modern world we live in. And back to Bodie. So that pretty much concludes my show on this. Thank you all for coming.